Okay, well, good morning, brothers and sisters, friends and colleagues. The Google clock says it's 9 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. And I'd like to ask Marshall Goodrich if he'll come up and offer an invocation as we begin this wonderful day together. Marshall? Thank you very much, Marshall, and thank you all for being here. All of us involved with the BYU New Testament Commentary Project welcome you to this third annual New Testament Conference. And today, we celebrate the release of the substantial and significant commentary on 1 Corinthians, a truly monumental work by Michael Rhodes and Richard Draper, culminating several years of laborious research, translating, and commentary. I've dreamed for many years of seeing this day, an LDS commentary based on the Greek to help readers understand the original context and feel the Spirit as they read important texts in the Bible. No other letter of Paul, in my mind, has greater affinity with LDS thought and practice than does 1 Corinthians. So we'll have a wonderful day today, thinking of many of those things. We also celebrate today the conclusion of our first New Testament summer seminar. Two of our speakers, Avram Shannon and Ben Spackman, have been among our participants in the seminar this year. I'd like to ask all of the participants if they'll stand up, and you can see we've had 5 weeks together going over all of the texts of several of these commentaries. We congratulate them and thank all of the participants who, among many other things, have examined this commentary on 1 Corinthians very closely. And we release this commentary today in its ebook form. Thank you, brethren. Well, this commentary on 1 Corinthians is by far the most extensive Latter-day Saint effort of its kind on any epistle of Paul. This commentary will certainly not be the end of the conversation, but a solid foundation, to use a phrase from Paul, upon which further Latter-day Saint studies and interests can build. We welcome today also 4 distinguished out-of-town visitors, Craig Blomberg, Kevin Barney, Julie Smith, and Brock Mason. And we also thank Brigham Young University, the Temple Studies Group, the Interpreter Foundation, BYU Studies, and its staff, especially Jenny Hurlbut and Marnie Parkin. Marnie has done all the typesetting on these commentaries. I also want to recognize Eric Huntsman, the new chair of the Commentary Editorial Board. Another board member, Kent Brown, who has served as the chair of our editorial board, is away now serving a mission with his wife in the Turkish city of Izmir, ancient Smyrna, where they held last Sunday their first sacrament meeting. I don't know how long it's been since one has been held in that city. Kent's volume on the Gospel of Luke is now off the press in hard copy, and you may see display copies of it here on the tables, where you may also pick up your coupon for the e-book version of 1 Corinthians. Now, I want to introduce our topic today with a slideshow about Paul and Corinth, and I recognize the help of Kent Brown in helping to put this together. Much learning comes from being on locations such as Corinth or Ephesus or the Galilee, bringing to light many of the things spoken of in the Scriptures. The written commentary gets you closer to the text of the New Testament. Being there adds new dimensions to understanding the Corinth that the Apostle Paul knew. By traveling to Corinth, people may well wonder and productively reflect on many questions. Why did Paul go there? What did he find there? How did he respond to the challenges and opportunities there? What did he accomplish there? What were the problems he left behind, and how does he respond to those problems in the letters that he wrote? The speakers today will help us all answer such questions. But first, let's think a little bit more about who Paul was, this tremendously influential early apostle of Jesus Christ. I've found it very helpful to think about Paul as coming from a very privileged and wealthy background. Most people don't think of Paul this way, but consider the following. Paul was born a Roman citizen, a rare and extremely valuable privilege in the Eastern Mediterranean of his day, especially for a Jew. He was certainly well educated in the classical traditions taught in Tarsus. He did well enough that his father, a Pharisee, was able to send him all the way to Jerusalem and bought for him the best education that money could buy, being personally tutored by the famous Gamaliel. Only a person with ample means and reputation could have been entrusted by the Sanhedrin at a young age to go to Damascus to arrest Christians. I've even wondered, did Paul pay his expenses and maybe all of the expenses of that expedition himself? Paul is known by the book of Acts as a tent maker, but modern people do not realize that tent making was actually a much bigger business in Paul's day than just making Coleman tents for camping. Any products made of heavy cloth, including tents for soldiers, awnings for shops and coverings over theaters, sails for ships, and any kind of heavy sacks for shipping produce, were all made by people in the so-called tent-making business. Obviously, making such things, especially sails for ships and sacks for cargo, would have been a service in high demand in the port city of Corinth. Paul also often appeared in court, as happened once here in Corinth, and at least to hear his side of the story, like most lawyers, we only hear the times he won. But clearly Paul knew his way around in these legal circles. Paul also traveled, and who else could travel as widely and be so experienced in economic and aristocratic circles as he? It was difficult to transport money from one province to another, and Paul was able to take money from the churches of Asia all the way to Jerusalem. Who else could write letters? Let's see, we got to get you here. Who else could write letters, use a scribe, have certain expensive books, and travel with an entourage, except for a person of some means? In Ephesus, Paul taught regularly for two years in the school of Tyrannus. And in Corinth, he apparently became a good friend of Erastus, a civic official responsible for all the public buildings in town. And most of all, why else would the Roman procurator Felix have hoped to bribe Paul in Caesarea if Paul had no money, or alternatively had wealthy relatives who could pay for his release? Even after arriving in Rome as a prisoner, Paul was still able to rent a place for 2 years large enough to receive many guests. But perhaps most of all, Paul liked to live in capital cities. Think about this. Paul was born in Tarsus, the capital city of the Roman province of Cilicia. He went, of course, to Jerusalem, and then another important city, Damascus, and soon found his way to Antioch, the capital city of Syria, the most important province in the Eastern Mediterranean. On his first missionary journey, Paul stops in Cyprus and goes right to Paphos, the capital city of the Roman province on that mineral-rich island. Paul then goes to Philippi, the capital city of the province of Macedonia. And after a couple of days in Athens and that area, Paul settles in Corinth, the capital city of the province of Achaia. After 18 months there, Paul moves to Ephesus, the capital city, you guessed it, of Asia, where he stays for 3 full years, eventually finding his way back to Jerusalem where he is arrested, taken to Caesarea, the capital city of Judea. Well, there's something about being able to run in high circles that an ordinary tent maker wouldn't be able to do. Obviously, Paul was at home in places like Ephesus, with its massive theater seating over 25,000 people, many of them yelling for Paul's death over the silversmith controversy. But Paul was important enough to be protected by the legal officials in Ephesus. In Athens, Paul rubbed shoulders with philosophers down in the Agora, and he was almost immediately invited to address the Areopagus, the governing body of elders who met on Mars Hill near the Acropolis. But the shrewd and well-connected Paul chose instead to position himself in Corinth, the crossroads of the East. As you see here, Corinth is located by an important isthmus, connecting the Peloponnese in the south with the mainland of Attica to the north. Ships from Italy would come into the Gulf of Corinth. Goods would be transported across the isthmus and loaded again on ships at Cenchrea on the Bay of Salamis. In fact, it was here at Cenchrea that Paul arrived from Athens, and a year and a half later, he would depart from there for Ephesus. Today, a canal is cut through the isthmus, and visitors can see this. It took 10 years in the late 19th century to cut this canal out of the bedrock stone. The idea of building the canal, however, was very ancient. Caligula had the isthmus surveyed, and Nero actually started the operation in 67 AD, using 6,000 Jewish prisoners sent by Vespasian from Judea. But the work was halted to put down an insurrection in Gaul. Tourists usually cross over the canal on a bridge. The bridge is only 36 yards long, but 200 feet above the water. But if you're afraid of heights, you can go the low road and cross over not a drawbridge, but here a sink bridge. Have you ever seen one of those? It goes up and down, and when it's down, allows the ships to sail through. Even at a distance, as you approach Corinth, Acrocorinth stands in the distance and in plain view. It's a massive stone outcropping, and it dominates the area around the city of Corinth. It is a beautiful spot, very well protected, and among the strongest natural fortresses of Europe. From the top of Acrocorinth, the Gulf of Corinth can be seen off to the west, and to the east, the Cenchrea harbor and the Saronic Gulf can be seen, with Corinth then in the middle. Numerous fascinating archaeological records here bear witness of the interests and concerns at Corinth that are often even explicitly reflected in 1 Corinthians. For example, the Isthmian Games, which took place here every other year, increased the importance of Corinth. And Paul likes to draw object lessons from the daily world around him. And here he seems to have had the games in mind when he used athletic metaphors in chapter 9, saying that he did not strive for a corruptible crown. Now you have to know that the crown that people were given when they won at the Isthmian Games was a wilted celery crown. Imagine it. That was given to the winners, not a corruptible crown, Paul says. He also says he didn't run uncertainly, and he was not a shadow boxer, but he testified from personal knowledge and revelation and the Holy Ghost. From where the bus drops you off, by the remains of a small odeon, or a theater, you can look up the hill to the south, and there again is Acrocorinth, where at the top stood a famous temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of erotic love. The infamy of its lurid cult was legendary, although perhaps exaggerated. We like to exaggerate such things. throughout the Roman world. But thus, in Corinth's pervading milieu of sexual promiscuity, it is easy to conceptualize Paul's strong warnings against all kinds of sexual relations outside of marriage, his expurgation of incest in chapter 5, and his excoriation of people who unite themselves with harlots in 6:16. And looking downhill from that same spot toward the north, you can see across the Gulf of Corinth toward the mountains near Apollo's Delphi in the distance. The harbor and suburb areas of Old Corinth are in the foreground here. In its most flourishing period, Corinth is said to have had a population of at least 300,000 people. The city was destroyed by an earthquake in 375 AD. Today, visitors enter this archaeological site passing by the fountain of Glaucon. Like most water sources in ancient Greece, this was a sacred spring. After all, water was recognized as a gift from the gods. Here, Paul too would have seen an object lesson, but he would have seen those water sources in a new light, knowing that Jesus was the true water of life. And so in chapter 10, verse 4, he refers to the Israelites in the wilderness when they drank of that spiritual rock, and that rock was Christ. The most prominent ruin at Corinth is then the great Temple of Apollo, one of the oldest temples in Greece dating to the mid-6th century BC. Presumably, it is the famous Temple of Apollo, referred to by ancient authors that way, but no sure proof of its dedication has been found. Pausanias mentions a gold statue of Apollo here, but gives no other details, and so unfortunately the cult practice which would have occurred here is completely unknown. But we do know that Apollo was the god of music, truth, prophecy, revelation, medicine and healing, the sun and light, poetry, and more. Paul has much to say about prophecy and revelation that would have directly challenged or reinterpreted Apollo as the source of prophecies and oracles. In Hellenistic times, beginning in the 3rd century BC, as Apollo Helios, Apollo had become identified among Greeks as the sun, the Titan god Helios, and his sister Artemis was similarly equated with Selene, the Titan goddess, the moon. In these connections, one wonders, might Paul's reference in chapter 15:41 to a glory of the sun and another of the moon be thinking of another reality and not just those glories for Titan gods? Epicurus had been a citizen of Corinth 3 centuries before the New Testament time, but his ideas persisted through his philosophical progeny, the Stoics. Among the many teachings of Epicurus was the idea that all truth could be found in nature. Might this not be the springboard against which Paul rebounds at the beginning of 1 Corinthians when he contrasts knowing things by the spirit of nature and the spirit of the natural man in distinction from knowing things by the Spirit of God? Here is an array of Corinthian vases. When Paul says, "If the dead rise not, let them eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die," he may have had banquets in mind that used such pottery. Both the Epicureans and the Jews in Corinth would have related to that statement by Paul. Indeed, the same wording is not only used by Epicureans, but actually found also in Isaiah chapter 22, which says, "Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die." Here you see the old stretch of the old Lycaon road running up from the harbor into the center of Corinth. On its left side is the fountain of Pyrene. The water is stored in 4 long reservoirs fed by a transverse supply tunnel. The reservoirs are hidden by the fountain house, which has those 6 arched facades, the facade with those 6 arches. The chambers inside are made like grottos from which the water flowed into a basin in the open air. This spring was rebuilt by the Romans as a public bathhouse. Many such bathing places were used by Christians as baptistries, and Paul remembers baptizing Crispus, Gaius, and the household of Stephanas in Corinth. One might only wonder where those baptisms took place. The broad paved Lycaon road leads directly to the Propylaea, the gateway to the Agora, and here you can see its entrance. The old sign years ago read, "Enter at your own risk, danger." And they were thinking, of course, of tripping over the rubble there. But I wondered if Paul hadn't felt that way walking into this formidable place, although he was running into other kinds of risks, of course. Lining that main road, and all of the main roads in Corinth, were shops and residences. We learn much about urban conditions from those ruins. You can see the holes in the walls up here. See these holes were used for positioning the wooden ceiling beams that would have been used. These structures were actually 3-story units. Other places were built almost entirely of wood, and with all that wood around, fire was always a problem in ancient cities, especially with cooking fires and lamps burning almost commonly and continuously. A reality that Paul mentions in chapter 3, verse 15, when he says that some people's works will be burned by fire. Also, the scum and off-scouring in Paul's metaphor in chapter 4 may have been suggested to him by the sewage, garbage, and filth of these cities, where they had no weekly garbage collections, was a dominant and persistent part of life in the city. Here from another angle, you can see how these partitions were divided as separate properties, sharing a common wall. We thought condominiums were modern inventions. We can imagine Paul's nerve, that when he was expelled from the synagogue, he moved in with a man named Justus, a God-fearer, whose home, it says, shared a common wall, or was hard next to the door, the room next door, which was the synagogue. Indeed, there was a synagogue in Corinth, as these 2 later museum artifacts indicate. One of them is an old inscription, not from the time of Paul, but the last 4 letters of the word synagogue are followed then by the first 3 letters of the word Hebrew. And more significantly, this stone may well have come from the synagogue, a capital decorated with 3 menorahs. Thus, one imagines Paul standing on the doorstep of Justus's home, right next to the synagogue, discoursing with the Jews in and out of the synagogue. And you know what? He actually converts Crispus, the leader of the synagogue. On the west end of the forum stood 6 small temples, to Hercules, Poseidon, Hermes, and a pantheon to all the gods. And right in that same area was the meat market, selling meat, some of which had been sacrificed to the gods. This made it impossible to tell whether any particular piece of meat was sacrificially contaminated or not, explaining the situation that Paul has to deal with in chapter 8. In Paul's day, the Roman presence in Corinth was very strong. This is the upper agora. It had a number of administrative offices. Most of Corinth's ruins, like these, date from the Roman period. Corinth actually was rebuilt by Julius Caesar around 45 BC, and so it was still a fairly modern city when Paul arrived. Images of Augustus Caesar commanded attention. Guards stood watch. Roman citizens, including Paul, wore the toga. As a Roman citizen, Paul probably felt safer here than in predominantly Greek cities such as Thessalonica and Athens, where he had quickly encountered troubles. Among the population were confident men, attractive youths, and dutiful slaves. Whether a slave or free, Paul said, each who is called in the Lord is Christ's servant or slave. There were also accomplished, powerful women. All of these statues are of Roman citizen women. These various statues can all remind us of Paul's statement in chapter 12, verse 12, that the body of the church is made of many members, a passage that Joseph Smith used in 1842 at the third organizational meeting of the Relief Society, rejoicing that each member performs crucially important functions in the church. Impressive gates led into the forum, reminding us of the power and wealth that was here. On this column, you go by an inscription with the name of Seneca, the philosopher, Nero's tutor, and the brother of Gallio, who was the proconsul when Paul was there. No wonder Paul writes in a high stylistic register, rhetorically, to this city. From that main entrance, the remains of a grand stoa or colonnade with a central arch is off there to our right. The forum ahead of us, the level spot, is, as you can see there, in the middle, and the bema, or the rostrum, I'll show you more detail, is off to the left. But here's what the arch and the agora, as we look at it today, here's what it looks like today. With the Temple of Apollo, you can see, and the sacred district right up behind it. But here's what it looked like in the 1960s. So lots of archaeological reconstruction and good work has been done there. And the artists have done their thing too. This is what it would have looked like in Paul's day. And today, looking down from the Temple of Apollo back into the Forum, we can imagine many things as we think of the way of life that must have been here during Paul's time. We can imagine the bustling crowd, their clothing, the sound of Greek voices, Latin being spoken, maybe even the thoughts of some of the people of that day, calling to mind many of the words of Paul. And most poignantly, right in the middle of the Forum, we come to the bema, or the rostrum, which takes us back to the story of Paul and the synagogue. Sosthenes, the new chief of the synagogue, eventually sued Paul and tried to get Gallio to punish him. Now, whether Gallio issued his decision from this place or from some other judgment seat in an administrative office, we don't know. But one gets the impression that he made his pronouncement in a prominent public place, like this one. For after Gallio drove the loser Sosthenes from the judgment seat, Acts 18 says, all the Greeks took him and beat him right on the spot. Victory. Paul must have loved it. Well, maybe. I don't think Paul liked being in court, however. In chapter 6, Paul inveighs against the unseemly practice of Christians suing other Christians in Greek or Roman courts. And here you see such a courtroom, a Prytaneum. Notice the altar there constructed out of the rubble. Why is an altar there in the middle of the courtroom? Well, in fact, all Greek and Roman judicial proceedings began with sacrifices. sacrifices to the gods, and required litigants and witnesses to swear oaths in the name of those same gods. That practice would obviously have been problematic for Paul at many levels: social, ecclesiastically, and theologically. These three columns are all that remain of the Temple of Octavia, Augustus's sister. It may have been built slightly after the time of Paul, but above it, on the architrave, is the word liberi, if you can see that up here, which indeed shows that Corinth was a free city within Rome, meaning that it was tax-free, didn't have to pay Roman taxes or customs, giving it a lot of special status. Notice the corner of this temple where you can see a foundation stones, a platform on which the pillars were built. I think Paul was impressed with the orderliness of these buildings, and Paul used it as a metaphor for the order of the church, being without divisions, stones neatly fit together, built upon a solid foundation with apostles, prophets, teachers, healers, administrators, and all kinds of people. Paul says, chapter 3, verse 11, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let every one take heed how he buildeth thereupon. In the sidewalk, down below the large semicircular theater, is an inscription. It says, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, his public official position, laid the pavement at his own expense. Paul greets an Erastus in Romans chapter 16:23. Probably, I think, the same person. Paul ran again in high social circles in Corinth. Well, this small boat's sail is a reminder of something that Prisca and Aquila, other friends of Paul, might have actually made with him in the tent-making trade. Roman women in Corinth dressed elegantly with elaborate cosmetics and hairstyles. In this context, at the end of chapter 13, Paul leaves his memorable statement about how we now see through a glass darkly. As the Greek reads, we see enigmatically by means of a bronze mirror, an esoptron. Here's a great example of one such bronze mirror from Corinth. As you see, it's not made of glass, but of bronze, which a person would polish, the backside, not this side with the drawing in it. And you'd polish it as best you could, but even with the best of polishing, in this world, the image of the mirror was still quite obscure. But Paul says, in the next life, standing before God, we will see face to face, clearly, not through some kind of obscure medium, knowing not only Christ and God, but also seeing ourselves fully and eternally. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul famously addresses the gifts of the Spirit, and he includes there the gift of healing. As mentioned before, Apollo was the god of medicine and healing, and this was especially practiced under the name of Apollo's son, Asclepius. And in Corinth, there was a temple to Asclepius. People who were healed there would bring votive offerings of thanks, as evidenced by these archaeological findings of arms, feet, and other body parts that had been healed. For Paul and the apostles, continuing Jesus' powers and practices of healing was an important part of their true apostolic mission. Paul himself being a healer, and even once being healed of near blindness and raised from near death. And speaking of death, Paul concludes 1 Corinthians with a long discussion of life after death and resurrection. Greek tombs, such as this one, frequently showed the husband and wife and children or nuclear family members in their hopeful desire to live together in the next life. And life after death and cults of the underworld were of special concern in Corinth. Not far away was Eleusis, where the famous Eleusinian mysteries were celebrated. A sacred well into the underworld, Pluto's cavern, and the sacred precinct of Demeter and Persephone all have to do with the Eleusinian mysteries, which inducted initiates into secret knowledge about the world of the dead below. Paul's discussion of resurrection illustrates yet another way in which Paul's teachings stood in sharp, transforming contrast with the Greek and Roman practices that were common among the Corinthian population. In conclusion, we are fortunate that Paul wrote letters. Here's a writing case displayed in a small museum in Thessalonica, the city to which Paul wrote from Corinth. Paul chose Corinth as the center of his apostolic mission because it was the leading city in Greece. It had recently risen to unrivaled prosperity and also notorious luxury and vice. In 1 Corinthians, Paul addresses lots of problems. It's a good thing there were so many problems. Without them, we wouldn't have known Paul's instructions and corrective guidance. Paul eventually left this part of the world to find his way to Rome, the capital of all capitals. In Rome, we see the culmination of Paul's extraordinary dedication as a missionary and as apostle of Jesus Christ, facing whatever legal challenges might come from his citizen's appeal to Caesar on charges brought against him in Jerusalem. Paul gave all that he had to the Savior, all of his time, all of his training and talents, which were substantial, all of his social and political connections, and much of his legal acumen, which was formidable, and all of his financial resources, much of which he must have walked away from in becoming a Christian. And whatever he had left, he gave all of that too. Paul, a servant or slave of Christ, was consecrated in word and in deed. I hope that this introduction sets the stage for our conference today, telling us a little bit about who Paul was, about how he responded to the world around him, and how he testified and served the Master of Jesus Christ. So, I testify that Paul's words are of great importance and relevance to us today. I thank God that we have his words, his testimony, and that we can spend this day rejoicing and studying over these materials. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.